Hello, welcome to Midweek Bible video number 17. We'll be continuing in Romans today as well as our normal things. So we'll be starting with the New City Catechism question number 9, which we did last week. And the question is, what does God require in the first, second and third commandments? So remember, the previous question was, what are the 10 commandments? What does God require in the 10 commandments of the law? Now it's the details of the first 3. And the answer, if you take a moment to remember what it is, the answer is, first, that we know and trust God as the only true and living God. Second, that we avoid all idolatry and do not worship God improperly. Third, that we treat God's name with fear and reverence, honouring also his word and works. So if you remember, I'll flick back. The first 3 commandments: you shall have no other gods before me, you shall not make for yourself an idol in the form of anything in creation or bow down to them and worship them, you shall not misuse the name of the Lord your God. And this explicates those 3, doesn't it? It says, well, only having God as your God is that we know and trust God as the only true and living God. We don't say, well, something else might be just as true and living. Second, we avoid all idolatry and do not worship God improperly. The implication here is that God has, via, amongst other things, the second commandment, explained how he wants to be worshipped. There's not a sort of optional hobby component to Christian worship. You don't pick things you like and then say, well, I'll do this, but I won't do that. Rather, you worship God according to the way he has asked you to do so. One way he's banned from you doing so is using statues or whatever, graven images. Which obviously implies that you don't make pictures of God. Third, that we treat God's name with fear and reverence, honouring also his word and works. Here, God's name, Yahweh, I am what I am, I'm doing what I'm doing, is being used not just in terms of respect his name, don't misuse it, but also as a, by kind of reverse synecdoche, to mean also his word and works, what he says and what he does. His name represents not just sort of the identity of God, but the works of God as well. So the first 3 commandments are not in that sense just bans, but they are also commands to do something positive. Worship God, worship him as he wants to be worshipped, and treat his name, his word, his works with fear, reverence and honour. Now question 10 is, what does God require in the 4th and 5th commandments? What does God require in the 4th and 5th commandments? And they are, 4th, that on the Sabbath day we spend time in public and private worship of God, rest from routine employment, serve the Lord and others, and so anticipate the eternal Sabbath. 5th, that we love and honour our father and mother, submitting to their godly discipline and direction. I keep the Sabbath day holy, honour your mother and father. And we'll go over that next week. Now we're in Watson's All Things for Good. We are in the end of chapter 2, I believe. This is the very final section of it. Chapter 2, section 4, subpoint 2, subpoint C, or 3 in this, and then the final 3 subpoints of that. And then there is a conclusion as well. It's up on the screen. I'll read from my book as well. So the general theme here was that God works our sin for good. He works it by overruling it in our hearts, and particularly that the sense of our sin, the fact we know we are sinful, puts the soul on 6 special duties. And the final 3 of those are: sin puts a child of God upon self-conflicting. Spiritual self conflicts with carnal self. The spirit lusts against the flesh, Galatians 5:17. Our life is a wayfaring life our life is a wayfaring life and a warfaring life. There is a duel fought every day between the 2 seeds. There is a duel fought every day between the 2 seeds. A believer will not let sin have peaceable possession. If he cannot keep sin out, he will keep sin under. Though he cannot quite overcome, yet he is overcoming. to him that is overcoming, Revelation 2:7. Sin puts a child of God, this is point 5 or E, upon self-observing. He knows sin is a bosom traitor, therefore he carefully observes himself. A subtle heart needs a watchful eye. The heart is like a castle that is in danger every hour to be assaulted. This makes a child of God to be always a sentinel and keep a guard about his heart. A believer has a strict eye over himself, lest he fall into any scandalous enormity, and so open a sluice to let all his comfort out. 6. F. Sin puts the soul upon self-reforming. A child of God does not only find sin out, but drives out sin. One foot he sets upon the neck of his sins, and the other foot he turns to God's testimonies. Psalms 119:59. Thus the sins of the godly work for good. God makes the saints' maladies their medicines. But let none abuse this doctrine. I do not say that sin works for good to an impenitent person. No, it works for his damnation. But it works for good to them that love God, and for you that are godly. I know you will not draw the wrong conclusion from this, either to make light of sin, or to make bold with sin. If you should do so, God will make it cost you dear. Remember David, he ventured presumptuously on sin, and what did he get? He lost his peace. He felt the terrors of the Almighty in his soul, though he had all helps to cheerfulness. He was a king. He had skill in music, yet nothing could administer comfort to him. He complains of his broken bones. Psalm 51:8. And though he did at last come out of that dark cloud, yet some divines are of opinion that he never recovered his full joy to his dying day. If any of God's people should be tampering with sin, because God can turn it to good, though the Lord does not damn them, he may send them to hell in this life. He may put them to such bitter agonies and soul convulsions as may fill them full of horror and make them draw nigh to despair. Let this be a flaming sword to keep them from coming near the forbidden tree. And thus I have shown that both the best things and the worst things by the overruling hand of the great God do work together for the good of the saints. Again I say, think not lightly of sin. Well, one, obviously, there's really a continued theme of sin makes you self-critical. Knowing you have sin, that is to say, makes you self-critical. It makes you watch yourself carefully. It makes you, either a wayfaring life and a warfaring life, both and. So he's continuing in that, but the other thing that strikes me is that though in this conclusion, which, if you see on screen, is, well, it's not highlighting, but those 3 paragraphs that are basically on screen now, he wants to conclude by saying, okay, that's all good, but don't abuse this doctrine. It's interesting that he then sums up. He says, I've shown that these all work for good, which is the actual summary of the entire chapter, the entire sermon. But he gives the very final line and the third from last paragraph are all about not abusing it. And it's interesting, he feels that though he is actually quite radically claiming sin as a sort of consequent good, not as a good in itself, but as something God uses for good, it is interesting that it is there. He says, okay, I've done all this quite radically in a way that you don't associate with the Puritans necessarily, but he really does want to conclude by saying, nonetheless, please don't take this the wrong way. Don't think this means God doesn't care about sin. He does. But because it brings us to mourning, if we are godly, it's good for us. But then, as I say, he really wants to hammer that home in the last line. Again, I say, think not lightly of sin. Think of it's good for you, that God works through your sin and through the sin of others, but never think it is good. Never take it lightly. And there's a challenge there that very often we can, in the words of Romans, we can sin more so grace might abound, or at least we might think lightly of sin because grace abounds. And both Paul in Romans, but also Watson here, when preaching on Romans 8, is very keen to say that is not a Christian appreciation of sin. A Christian appreciation of sin is mourning, rather than sort of, I'm glad God's done something good with it, So now we are in Romans for our Bible study series. We're in Romans 1, verses 8 to 15 we'll do today. And I'll just read that out. I'll flick so that we've got it up on screen. It's in the middle there. And this is what Paul says. First, I thank my God through Jesus Christ for all of you, because your faith is proclaimed in all the world. For God is my witness, whom I serve with my spirit in the gospel of his Son, that without ceasing I mention you, always in my prayers, asking that somehow, by God's will, I may now at last succeed in coming to you. For I long to see you, that I may impart to you some spiritual gift to strengthen you. That is, that we may be mutually encouraged by each other's faith, both yours and mine. I do not want you to be unaware, brothers, that I have often intended to come to you, but thus far have been prevented, in order that I may reap some harvest among you as well as among the rest of the Gentiles. I am under obligation both to Greeks and to barbarians, both to the wise and to the foolish. So I'm eager to preach the gospel to you also who are in Rome. So, this is Paul explaining his reason for writing. He's introduced himself in the previous 7 verses. We did that last week. You know, he's an apostle called to spread the gospel through the Gentile, the non-Jewish world. And that's why he can write to the Roman church, even though he didn't start the church in Rome. You see that in verse 6. He says, I've been given the job by God to bring about the obedience of faith amongst the Gentiles. And that includes you, who are in Rome, who belong to Jesus Christ in Rome. He then is going to be, he's then developing this with why he's writing. I can write to you, even though we don't know each other very well, we've never met, and this is why I am writing to you. And he starts this passage with his thanks to God for the Roman church, verse 8, that is. And this is common in his letters. We talked about this in Philippians, that he nearly always, after the superscript or the prescript where he introduces himself, he then said, by the way, I thank God for you. He doesn't, I think, with the Galatians, so it's not universal. The angrier he is, the more he thinks there's a crisis, the less likely he is to add that in. But here he wants to make clear he thanks God for them. He often, starts it by thanking God, and in this case it is particularly because the faith of the Roman church is proclaimed throughout the world. Because your faith is proclaimed in all the world, he says. And why does this matter? Well, because the gospel has penetrated to the heart of the Mediterranean world. At this stage, the gospel is mostly spreading inside the Roman Empire. Though we do hear that some of the apostles, in historical documents, some of the apostles headed east as well, even as far as to India. Perhaps they went as far as Ethiopia. Those are places outside the Roman Empire. But here, it's inside the Roman Empire. But the Roman Empire is therefore the chief sphere of mission, if you like. The church, therefore, reaching its capital, that's big news. The Roman Empire is the big place we're working in. The capital of the Roman Empire, that is the heart of that world. The gospel reaching it is big news. The kingdom of God is beginning to openly encroach on the kingdom of Caesar. It is saying there is a new king coming. The man is coming around. And verses 9 and 10 then move to connect Paul further to the Romans. He's already asserted his authority over the matter of the gospel. Now he's demonstrating a relational connection. He prays for the Romans. He prays particularly, I always in my prayers, he says, for God is my witness, when this idea, this passionate look, I promise, God is my witness, I pray for you always in my prayers. It's very passionate. And he's praying particularly that he might be able to come to them. He serves the gospel of God's Son, and that's the context in which he speaks about visiting them. You see, he's creating a relational connection, and it's particularly based on the shared gospel, which, as we've said, is Paul's particular job. And he's saying he cares for them. He prays for them constantly. And he expands on that in verses 11 and 12. He wants to come to them. He wants to come to them so that he might impart to them some spiritual gift to strengthen grace. And this could mean a specific enumerated gift mentioned elsewhere. He might want to teach them a particular thing or prophesy a particular thing. But probably the spiritual gift here is non-specific. He wants to bless them in spiritual ways. And it might include, and probably does include, teaching, prophecy, pastoring. But in a general sense, he means he wants to come and offer the gospel to them, to explain its details to them, to help them understand it, to encourage them, to help them realise the gospel in their lives. And see verse 15 for this. He concludes the whole section we're talking about today by mentioning that specifically he wants to preach the gospel to those in Rome. He wants to proclaim it. And he actually sees the relationship between church and apostle as mutually edifying and mutually blessing. Verse 12, he suggests the faith of the Romans is encouraging, or might be encouraging, to him. He doesn't just want to bless them, he wants them to bless him. And there's an interesting pattern generally in Paul's letters, which we discussed in our series on Philippians, of him seeking a blessing from the churches he's writing to. It's basically never a financial blessing. He never says, please could you send me money to support myself. He does ask for financial blessing for the poor in Jerusalem. He accepts money from the Philippians, but he doesn't ask for it. He says thanks for the gift. He rejects money from other churches. He thinks they are too immature. So the gift he wants, they're things like obedience to God, endurance in difficulty, or here the very faith of the Romans himself. Complete my joy is about faith when he says that. And here he's saying, I want to be encouraged by your faith and your obedience to God. As he said in verse 8, the Romans have a faith famous throughout the Christian world. It's a faith that's flourishing in the heart of the pagan world, in the city that Revelation calls the New Babylon. Paul is encouraged by their faith, and he wants to be further encouraged by it by going to Rome itself. He's heard about this great work of God and he wants to see it. He wants to be encouraged by what God is doing in Rome. And that's a very natural thing, isn't it, for a Christian, you'd hope, to want to see what God is doing. And it is a humble thing as well. Paul doesn't see the task of being an apostle or an elder or whatever else as, well, it's what Jesus says, do not lord, you are not meant to lord it over each other like the Gentiles do. It is a matter of each part of the body having a different role, and therefore Paul, as a part of the body who travels around, if you like, a mobile part of the body. I don't know what exactly that would be, but he travels around blessing all the different smaller bodies. He wants to be blessed by them. He wants them to do their bit for him like he does his bit for them. And Paul is taking a fatherly role in a lot of ways here, isn't he? He wants to enjoy and, if you like, be proud of the successes of the Roman Christians. It is natural, and you see this, it's what he talks about in terms of the inheritance he wants to store up for the Corinthians. He sees himself as a father. Both in 1 Corinthians where he says not many of your fathers, and in 2 Corinthians where he talks about building up a spiritual inheritance for them. And I think it's something we know, don't we, any of us who are parents, but even those of us who aren't could say, yes, I know what it's like to be proud of someone, and that's a blessing for me. And so Paul wants to be proud of the work of God in them. It's not just because, though, he's the father in faith, it's not because he's the father in their faith personally, but because he has this broader job from God that encompasses the Roman Christians. So he wants to present himself to them as an impressed father figure. So it's relational, it's spiritual, it's strategic. And verse 13 is both an explanation of why he hasn't visited and a statement of intent, of Paul's desire. So he's moved on from I wish I could come, I wish we could mutually encourage each other, to this is why I haven't come, and this is what I want to do. He hasn't visited because he's been prevented. He's wanted to come, he's considered Rome and its church valuable, but he has been prevented. And we can extrapolate from what he says at the end of this letter and from the record of his works in Acts that he largely means he's been prevented by his gospel work. Yeah, there have been physical delays, pains, difficulties, persecutions, disasters, but mostly it is not pressing tent-making business or a lack of ships that mean he hasn't gone to Rome. It is the purposes of God. So they shouldn't feel resentful that he hasn't been, despite his role in the Gentile mission. They should recognise that he has a good reason not to have come. The only thing that could prevent Paul from his great desire, his daily prayer to meet the Romans, is the fact that God has set more immediate priorities. This also explains why Paul writes, in order that I may reap some harvest among you as well as among the rest of the Gentiles. That's the end of verse 13. He can't come, so he's writing. If he had come, he wanted to reap a gospel harvest. He writes one infers to do at least a little bit of that. Otherwise, he could just write saying, a bit like actually the Apostle John says when he says, here's a brief instruction, I hope to come to you soon to talk about it. Paul doesn't know when he'll come, so he wants to set down some of what he would have said in person. And this is confirmed by verse 15 at some level. That's a summary. Paul sees Rome as his legitimate mission field. It's a city of Gentiles on the whole. it's not just an issue of his authority, I can write to you, it's an issue of his obligation, verse 14. He must write. It's not that he can, he has to do it. He must do it. He has to go out into the fields white with harvest that John is described in the Gospel of John. Jesus says the fields are white with harvest. He has to go to find a sheep in another sheepfold that Jesus describes in the same Gospel. It's not a possibility, it's a necessity for Paul to do this. And there's an interesting distinction given here in verse 14. Often we think of Paul saying there is no Jew or Gentile in Christ Jesus, the unity between the two tents or the two sheepfolds or the two seeds. He talks about it in Colossians. It's communicated by him and by others in other letters and other documents. But here, Paul says he is equally under obligation to Greek and barbarian, wise and foolish. Paul writes to the capital of the known world, and he says his mission is to all Gentiles, not just the civilized or the wise. And that's the distinction between Greek and barbarian, by the way. Barbarian comes from the word barbaros, which was the Greek word for someone who didn't speak Greek. It wasn't a word meaning nasty person or stupid person. Persians were barbarians despite their relative civilization, but rather it meant that their language was like the words ba 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 is baby talk. Even relatively civilized barbarians were not like the Greeks. But Paul is not simply coming for the civilized elites. He's not coming for the literary classes alone. Nor, to be fair, is he only targeting the poor and the uneducated. The gospel to the Gentiles is for everyone. It's not just for the Jews, but for the Gentiles. It's not just for the posh Gentiles or the clever Gentiles. It is for every Gentile. So even the barbaric German tribes beyond the Rhine and Danube borders, even at this point, we may be talking about an unconquered Britannia, even for barbarous Britons who aren't yet Roman. So Paul lays claim to all Gentiles in verse 14. And he's already connected Christianity to Judaism in verse 2, where he says the Messiah was prophesied in the Jewish scriptures and the scriptures. Everyone is to receive the gospel, therefore. The gospel is the subject of Paul's letter, and the recipients at some broad level are everyone. The recipients of the gospel is everyone. Paul doesn't only preach to Gentiles in Gentile cities, after all. He goes to synagogues too. Outside of Palestine, he will go anywhere. All those people should hear the gospel. We're going to hear what the gospel is soon, or in detail. And this is, by the way, a new type of religious claim. Christianity is neither pluralist, adopting many religions into a mishmash, like Greek or Roman or Parthian polytheism. That's a good God, we'll add him to our pantheon. Nor is it a national religion like Judaism. Our God is the God of Israel, and only ethnic Israel, they would say. Christianity is a universal and exclusive religion. One of the earlier uses of the term cosmopolitan related to Christianity, it also comes in philosophy of the time, particularly Stoic philosophy, but it was also a kind of term that floated in Christian circles in the early days. Christianity was a sort of cosmopolis, a city of the whole world. Cosmos, creation, polis, city, is the city of the world. And Rome, at the centre of the Mediterranean world, a cosmopolis in its own way, a city with so many different people in it. It's an obvious target for this new religion. So we've seen here that Paul develops his relationship with the Romans. He articulates, as we hinted at in the first 7 verses, that his purposes for writing are to explain the exclusively true gospel, to define who receives it. We've seen, by the way, there, he's already defined everyone should receive it, and he will expand why that is over the course of the letter. He hasn't yet defined the gospel in detail. He's hinted at it at the start, and he's about to move on to it. But it's worth considering one more thing as we kind of come toward the end of this introduction. Paul is writing to Romans. He's writing a sermon to the church at Rome. He's delivering it because he can't get there yet. He is not in Rome yet to preach the gospel. But we know that Paul did go to Rome. We know he went to Rome in Acts. By the end of Acts, he is about to present his case before the emperor. And we hear about the result of his physical preaching in Rome, when we studied Philippians. We've already heard it. If you've listened to these Bible studies, you know that Paul has preached to the Romans. Philippians chapter 1, verses 12 to 14. I want you to know, brothers, that what has happened to me, imprisonment in Rome, has really served to advance the gospel, so that it has become known throughout the whole imperial guard, and to all the rest, that my imprisonment is for Christ. And most of the brothers, having become confident in the Lord by my imprisonment, are much more bold to speak the word without fear. So Paul did, though here he's writing a letter to reap a harvest, eventually he does go to Rome. He does reap a harvest, even if it happened in a way most of us wouldn't choose. But Paul was satisfied with it. He knew it was the purposes of God, just as he knew the delay from him going to Rome was not his choice, but the will of God. He knew that eventually when he got to Rome and he was in prison and he was going to die, he knew that was the will of God and that God was reaping a harvest. So, in a funny way, this whole letter, the longest letter we have in the New Testament, is just a prologue to Paul's actual experience of preaching in Rome. And what we could see here is that this detailed content over the next 16 chapters is going to be what he preached when he got to Rome, which is a good way to connect it. By the way, it's also a good way to connect dates when you think this letter must have come before this letter. Next week, we will move on to these famous verses 16 and 17, which start with, "For I am not ashamed of the gospel, for it is," and we'll learn what the gospel is then. See you then.